Hello everyone. So I don't usually make videos on aircraft accidents. I prefer fun videos like airliners or some of my business trips or flying around in our club's Piper Cherokee. But this midair in Watsonville really hit home. This one was different. And I think the reason is because this could have been any of us. Like, you don't have to be flying very long before you start to get into some uncomfortable situations in the traffic pattern. I mean, some accidents are like, well, this guy ran out of gas, or there was a runway overrun on takeoff because he was 500 pounds over max takeoff weight with a high density altitude. And then some of these situations are easy to brush off because in the back of your mind, you're like, I'd never do that. But this accident was in good weather, VFR conditions, and the traffic pattern. I mean, this is practically every flight that we do. This isn't some obscure situation that someone got themselves into, but this is literally every flight for some of us. So the next time I'm flying and turning base to final, you can bet I'll be triple checking the extended final to make sure someone isn't coming in hot. Anyways, a quick recap if that's needed. So a Cessna 150 was in the pattern and a twin Cessna was on a long straight in final approach. They were both communicating and were definitely aware of each other. The first calls we hear is the twin Cessna calling 10 miles out and then the Cessna 150 calling crosswind. Just before the 152 turned base, the 340 called a 3-mile final. The Cessna 152 apparently then turned base and called it. Then the 340 called a 1-mile final and was looking for the traffic on base. However, at this point, the Cessna 152 was on final and says he saw the twin behind him and that he would go around because of the fast closure weight. And this is when they hit. So just a couple initial thoughts. In the pattern on crosswind, if this was me, I can be back on the ground in less than 4 minutes. Now, I fly a fairly tight pattern, so if someone is calling 10 miles out, I would be aware of them. But for me, anyways, my initial thought is that I'll likely be on the ground before they are any factor. Now, that doesn't mean I dismiss them entirely. I'm still listening, but my initial thoughts are they probably won't be a factor. But of course, this depends on your speed of the aircraft you're flying, how tight of a pattern you like to fly, or how tight of a pattern you have to fly to fit in with other traffic. And the 340 had been, and if the 340 had been flying normal approach speeds, there likely would have been adequate spacing. Maybe this exact sequence happened before and it worked out fine. So I say that because potentially the 3-mile final call by the twin Cessna might have caught this 152 off guard. He would have maybe expected him still to be further out. Obviously, that's not an excuse, but it could be a contributing factor. But at least it seems like through the downwind to base turn, the Cessna 152, everyone had a good situational picture of where each one was. So the twin was still 3 miles out, the 152 was turning base. Now, I think this is where most of us probably cringe a little bit when we're listening to the audio replay. Even if the twin was flying a normal approach speed, turning base with someone on a 3-mile final is definitely creating an uncomfortable situation. It's likely you would have enough time to, fly the base leg, turn, fly the final leg, land, clear the runway prior to the other aircraft, practically being on top of you. And then on top of that, you don't hear any calls from the Cessna 152 that he's on final. But he clearly was because he says he saw the twin behind him. Now, maybe I missed it. Maybe it's not in the recording. But potentially, if he would have called a short final and the twin is 1 or 2 miles out, maybe the twin would have then realized that he needed to go around. I mean, from what it appears his speed was, it's hard to imagine he thought he was in a good place for landing. And maybe the most heartbreaking thing is that the 152 pilot realized he wasn't in a good place. So he decided to go around, but it appears him initiating the go around and climbing into the flight path of the twin is what caused them to hit. So had he continued his descent, it's possible the twin coming in hot would have cruised right over him and maybe realized himself on short final that, hey, I need to go around. I'm not stabilized. So what can we learn from this sad situation? Well, I think one thing, and this is difficult, but it's to try to understand a potential traffic conflict when someone calls like miles out. Like this situation, an aircraft on a 3-mile final and he turned base. That's too close. But what if you have just taken off and someone calls 3 miles out on a 45 entry to a downwind? Or what if you were just ready to turn crosswind and an aircraft calls 2 miles out, overflying the field to join the downwind? You know, I've had kind of all these different situations happen. And then when something like this happens, which is a little bit unexpected, you almost find yourself like taking your mind off flying for a few seconds. Try to like mentally picture what's going on, who's coming and where, what their speed is, aircraft type, and then how you're going to compensate for it. So in all these cases, I think, you know, maybe the answer is to extend your traffic pattern one leg or the other, or, you know, maybe you need to do a 360, or you need to do something to provide adequate spacing. So each situation is probably a little unique. There's not one size fits all, and we need to be flexible in the pattern at these uncontrolled fields. So, I mean, obviously you want to try to always fly a standard pattern, but we need to be flexible when someone is joining the pattern. So I think the next lesson, and this is an obvious one, is to make the proper radio calls. And maybe I missed it, but if indeed this 152 didn't make the call that he was on final, that's a big deal. The twin didn't think he was on final yet. The twin's radio call was that he was still looking for the traffic on base, but the 152 was on final. So this is like the most critical point in the pattern, when the two aircraft didn't even know where each other one was. One aircraft was looking in a completely different location from where he actually was, because he was expected him to be on the other leg, because that's where his last call was. So the 152 pilot probably had a lot going on in his mind. At this point, he's probably getting nervous, looking for the other traffic. Where is him? I don't see him. Trying to get the plane lined up to land. It might have just slipped his mind. We don't know. Maybe another thing, it seemed to be, listening to this, there were different people stepped on that frequency. It would have been a terrible thing if he made the final call, but it was blocked because he got stepped on. That would have been bad. So anyways, radio communications, you know, and even more important, if there's potential traffic conflicts, it's important to be making the calls. And then I think lastly, this deal on straight-in approaches. I'd be a hypocrite if I said that everyone should always only enter a 45 to the downwind. I've done straight-ins, extended base to final entries, etc. However, I will say I've done those entries when the CTAF has been quiet and it didn't appear like there was anyone else in the area or in the pattern. If I hear other traffic, then I make a point to do the proper 45 degree entry. And following this procedure, sure, might add a few more minutes to your flight, but if there's traffic already in the pattern, it's so much easier, and everyone knows exactly where you are and what you're going to do, and it's much easier to provide proper spacing. So there you go, a couple thoughts on this tragedy. Anyways, we'll talk to everyone next time. Until then, fly safe.